A boy is aged out of the system and inherits a worthless piece of land only to discover a secret beneath it that will force him to choose between a safe future and a dangerous truth. What he decides to do with his grandfather's legacy isn't just a story about money or property. It's a story about what it means to finally build a home. If you've ever felt lost and then found your purpose in the last place you expected, hit that subscribe button because this is a space for stories like ours. The clock on the wall of the administrative office in Columbus, Ohio, clicked with a sound like a knuckle cracking against dry wood. Each click was 1 second closer to Eli Vance's 18th birthday, which was also his eviction date. For 7 years, the state of Ohio had been his landlord, his guardian, his stand-in for everything a family was supposed to be. In 3 days, it was going to fire him from the job of being its child. Ms. Wren Ashby sat across from him at the gray laminate table. She had been his caseworker for the final 2 of those 7 years. Her face held the particular stillness of someone who had delivered life-altering news so many times in so many directions that her expressions had learned to wait at a careful distance from her feelings. She slid a thin manila envelope across the table with 2 fingers, the way you might slide a playing card across felt. Eli looked at it. It was too thin to be a future. It was barely a past. He had spent the previous week cycling through mandatory exit interviews and life skills workshops. They taught him how to write a check against an account he did not have, how to format a resume for a job he had no address to apply for, how to smile during an interview so the person across the desk would not immediately see the 7 years of institutional hallways behind his eyes. They taught him the mechanics of existing in the world without teaching him how to stop being afraid of it. "There is one more thing," Ms. Ashby said. Her voice was quiet. It was not unkind. "It concerns your grandfather." The name hit him in the chest, not like a punch, more like the sudden recognition of a song you had not heard in a very long time, playing faintly from somewhere you could not quite locate. Walter Vance. The last real family Eli had ever known before all of this. Before the homes and the beige walls and the succession of temporary beds that all smelled faintly of someone else's fabric softener. Walter had died in the autumn of 2006 when Eli was 11 years old. A heart attack that came without warning on a Tuesday morning. One moment the man existed, the next he did not. And after him, there was nothing, just the state. It came from the county tax office in Holt County. Ms. Ashby continued tapping the corner of the envelope with one carefully trimmed nail. "Addressed to the agency as your legal guardian. It is unusual." Eli reached for it. His fingers felt unfamiliar at the ends of his hands. Inside was a single sheet of heavy paper covered in the dense block language that government documents use to say simple things in complicated ways. At the top, his grandfather's name. Below it, a parcel number and a legal description of a property Eli had never heard of. 1.2 acres in a place called Calder Ridge, Holt County, Ohio. The document was a tax delinquency notice. The property had been delinquent for 7 years and had technically reverted to the county. But a clause in the delinquency code, old and rarely cited, stated that because the registered heir had been a minor under state guardianship at the time of reversion, that heir retained a 30-day window upon reaching the age of majority to reclaim the property. The reclamation fee was listed at the bottom of the page. $6. Eli stared at the number. $6. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It came out sharp and dry like air pushed through a closing door. "What is on it?" he asked. Ms. Ashby turned her laptop around. On the screen was a grainy aerial photograph pulled from a county database. A flat, scrubby rectangle of land with a single structure at its center. Long and curved silver gray in the satellite image. Like a metal tube sliced lengthwise and set down on bare earth. "It looks like a Quonset hut," she said. "A prefabricated steel structure. Military surplus design, most likely. The county records do not list any utilities connected to the property." Eli looked at it for a long moment. He had been carrying something in the inside pocket of his jacket for the entire week. He had not told anyone about it. He had not even fully acknowledged it to himself. It was a habit from the group home years keeping certain things invisible, certain things only yours. The jacket was old. It had been Walter's. A brown canvas work coat with a corduroy collar too large for an 11-year-old boy, and then too large for a 12-year-old, and then somehow never quite wrong for a 17-year-old who had grown into his grandfather's dimensions without meaning to. Eli had worn it every autumn and winter for 7 years. It still smelled faintly of motor oil and pipe smoke if you pressed your face into the collar and did not breathe for a moment. He reached into the inside pocket and took out what was there. A piece of paper folded twice the creases worn white from years of being opened and opened again. He unfolded it slowly on the table. Ms. Ashby watched without speaking. It was a hand-drawn map. Rough pencil lines on yellowed paper, unmistakably drawn by someone who thought in precise measurements and careful angles. A rectangle of land, a structure marked at the center, and along the bottom edge in handwriting that Eli had recognized since he was small enough to sit on the floor of his grandfather's workshop and watch those same hands take apart an engine, 4 words. For Eli, when ready. No date, no signature, just those words and the careful drawing of a place Eli had never been. He had found it in the jacket pocket the winter he was 13. He had not known what the land was. He had not known where Calder Ridge was. He had carried it for 5 years the way you carry something that belongs to a story you do not yet understand, waiting for the chapter that gives it meaning. He laid it on the table next to the tax document. The outline of the structure on the hand-drawn map matched the shape of the Quonset hut in the satellite photograph, with the precision of something planned rather than coincidental. Ms. Ashby looked at both papers for a long time without speaking. "He knew about you," she said finally. "He was making sure you would find it." Eli folded the hand-drawn map and put it back in the inside pocket of Walter's jacket. Then he picked up the tax notice. 1.2 acres, a prefabricated steel hut, $6. It was not a future. But Walter had drawn him a map to it, and that was a different thing entirely. "How do I pay the $6? Eli asked. The next 2 days were the mechanical business of erasure. Eli packed his life into a single black duffel bag, 3 changes of clothes, a worn paperback he had read 4 times, a toothbrush, a photograph of Walter taken at some family gathering. Eli had been too young to remember the old man squinting slightly against afternoon light, one hand raised as if he had just been interrupted mid-sentence. That was the entirety of it. Ms. Ashby handled the money order for the $6 reclamation fee and overnighted it to the Holt County clerk. She appeared at the door of the group home on the morning of his departure with a coat she had purchased herself and a brown paper bag containing a sandwich and a water bottle. She did not make a ceremony of it. She simply held them out. "It gets cold in that part of the state," she said. The bus leaves from the terminal on 5th at 10:30. Eli took the coat and the bag. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. She adjusted the strap of her purse and looked briefly past him at the hallway he was leaving behind. "My job is to process you out of the system," she said. Her voice returned to its professional register. Then she met his eyes. "My purpose is to make sure you have a chance. Those are not the same thing." She gave him a small, contained smile, the kind that costs something to produce. "Go find out what your grandfather left you." Eli walked out the door. The air outside was cold and smelled of exhaust and the particular sharpness of a city morning in October. It was not the air of freedom he had imagined during the long institutional nights. It was just air, cold and indifferent and full of the noise of people going places they already knew how to go. He was the only one standing still. He was 18 years old. He had a duffel bag, a dead man's coat, a sandwich, and a deed to a rust-colored shed in a place he had never seen. It did not feel like a beginning. It felt like the moment after something ends when the silence comes in to fill the space, and you realize the silence is also yours now. The bus ride was 18 hours. It moved out of Columbus through the dense geometry of the city and into the sprawl of the suburbs, and then further into the flat open farmland of central Ohio. The sky got bigger as the landscape flattened. The trees grew sparse and then scarce. The other passengers thinned out at each stop until it was just Eli, an elderly woman sleeping with her chin on her chest, and the driver whose only communication was the occasional adjustment of the rearview mirror. Eli watched the landscape and tried to remember Walter Vance, not the softened version rounded by grief and childhood and the protective distortions of memory. The real man. Walter had been an engineer, not the kind who wore a tie, the kind who understood materials, the load-bearing properties of soil and steel and stone. His hands were never clean. His knuckles were mapped with old scars from decades of mechanical work. He smelled of the workshop always, oil and soldered metal, in the particular dry quality of a man who spent more time outdoors than in. He did not talk much about himself. When Eli, at 7 or 8 years old, had asked about his parents, Walter would look at some middle distance above Eli's head and say they were good people, Eli, in a voice that was carefully neutral, and then change the subject to whatever was on the workbench. The workshop behind Walter's house in Findlay was a place Eli had not been allowed to enter, not with any drama or alarm, just a closed door with a padlock that was always engaged, and Walter's matter-of-fact explanation, "That's my lab." Private. The few times Eli had pressed his face to the small window in the workshop door, he had seen tables covered in engineering drawings, notebooks stacked in organized towers, and equipment he could not name as a child. He had assumed it was the standard eccentricity of an old man with too much knowledge and not enough people to talk to. Now, watching the Ohio flatlands unreel past the bus window, he was no longer sure what to assume. Why would an engineer buy 1.2 acres of scrubland in an obscure rural county and install a military surplus metal structure on it, and then not tell his 11-year-old grandson about it, and then draw a map of it and leave that map in the pocket of a coat he gave the boy to keep Eli pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window? The bus stopped at Calder Ridge just after 4 in the afternoon. There was no station. There was a crossroads and a hand-painted sign that said, Calder Ridge Population 412, though the paint on the numbers was older than the paint on the rest of the sign, as if the population had been a point of optimism that no one had gotten around to correcting. A gas station with a light in the window. Across the road, a diner with paper taped over the inside of its windows and a hand-lettered close sign that looked permanent. The driver did not turn around. "This is you," he said. Eli shouldered his duffel bag and stepped down onto the gravel. The bus pulled away. Its sound diminished and was gone. The silence that replaced it was the silence that belongs to flat country, where the land offers nothing for wind to break against, and the nearest human voice is several miles in any direction. The air was different here, cleaner than the city, yes, but underneath the clean there was something else, a faint edge, chemical almost, like fertilizer but not quite. Eli stood still and breathed it in and could not name it. He filed it away and walked toward the gas station. The clerk was a teenager with the bored stillness of someone who had already decided that nothing happening in Calder Ridge would ever require urgency. He gave Eli directions with minimal investment. Old Man Vance's place. Yeah, out on the service road behind the Brannock property. 5 miles, maybe a little more. Nothing out there. Just dirt in that big tin can of his. The teenager paused. "You related to him," his grandson Eli said. The teenager looked at him for a moment with something that might have been curiosity if he had allocated more energy to it. Then he turned back to his phone. 5 miles. Eli adjusted the duffel bag on his shoulder and started walking. The cracked asphalt of the main road narrowed into a gravel track within a half-mile. The track curved east and then southeast and then straightened out across a wide, flat stretch of land where the vegetation was sparse and dry and the color of old straw. The sun was already low and dropping. By the time he had been walking for an hour, it was gone below the horizon, and the sky was a deep, bruised purple fading to black at the edges. There were no streetlights, no houses visible from the track. The only illumination was a crescent moon, thin and cold, which gave just enough light to distinguish the gravel from the dark scrub on either side. Eli walked in the dark and thought about his grandfather and did not let himself think about turning back. He saw the structure before he was fully aware of seeing it. The moon caught the curve of its roof, first a long silver arc against the black sky. Then the full shape resolved as he came closer, a Quonset hut maybe 60 feet long and 20 wide, sitting on a concrete pad in the middle of a property ringed by a sagging barbed wire fence. The land around it was matted with dead weeds and scrub brush. An old gate hung at an angle from one post, its hinge rusted through on one side. Eli stopped at the gate and looked at it. His kingdom. 1.2 acres of hard Ohio ground and a metal building shaped like the cross-section of a buried pipe. Walter had paid taxes on this for years apparently, and then stopped. And then left it to Eli in the form of a pencil sketch in a coat pocket. He pushed through the gate and crossed the property to the main door of the hut, a heavy sliding panel set in a metal track. The padlock hanging from the hasp was so corroded that it separated from the hasp body with 3 hard kicks and a sharp pull. The door resisted its track for a moment and then gave way with a grinding shriek of metal on metal. The air that came out was thick and cold. Damp earth, rust, the faint musk of mice. Eli clicked on the small flashlight that Miss Ashby had tucked into the paper bag alongside the sandwich. The beam cut through the interior darkness. The space was cavernous and almost empty. Rotted wooden crates in one corner, a rusted oil drum on its side, a layer of grime covering the concrete floor that was thick enough to hold the impressions of whatever had last moved across it years ago. The corrugated metal walls were traced with rust-brown watermarks where rain had found its way through the seams. The ceiling, the curved underside of the metal skin, disappeared into shadow above the range of the flashlight. It was not a home. It was the idea of shelter without any of its substance. Eli set his duffel bag down on the least filthy section of the floor. The sound of it hitting the concrete echoed off the curved walls and came back to him, altered, flattened like a sound heard underwater. He stood in the center of the space and turned slowly, the flashlight sweeping the interior. Rusted crates, a broken shelf bracket, mouse droppings along the wall, the oil drum, a crack in the floor near the south wall that was wide enough to lose a finger in. The wave, when it came, was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It arrived the way exhaustion arrives, not as a collapse, but as a weight that has been there all along, finally making itself fully known. Eli sat down on the duffel bag, the flashlight balanced across his knees, and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. He was not crying for himself. He understood that clearly. He was crying for Walter, for an old man who had spent years apparently on this patch of ground in this building, doing something Eli could not yet understand, and who had died before he could explain any of it, who had drawn a map and put it in a coat pocket and trusted that the boy would eventually find his way here. What had he been hoping for this quiet, scarred man with the oil-stained hands and the locked workshop and the eyes that held something Eli had never been able to name? What had he imagined this place becoming? Eli lowered his hands and looked at the interior of the hut in the thin beam of the flashlight and did not have an answer. He ate half the sandwich. He unrolled his spare jacket from the duffel bag to use as a pillow. He lay down on the concrete floor and listened to the wind work its way around the exterior of the building, finding the gaps in the seams, making the metal walls creak and settle with sounds like a ship in a quiet sea. The cold came up through the concrete from below with a patience that was almost deliberate. He did not sleep for a long time. The days that followed were organized around survival, not metaphorical survival, actual survival. The hut was cold. The wind found every gap in the structure. Eli spent the first full day stuffing rags torn from a rotted canvas tarp into the seams where the corrugated metal panels met the concrete foundation. He used a piece of scrap metal that had been lying near the south wall to cover the largest hole in the roof where rust had eaten through entirely. He found an old rain barrel around the back of the building, half buried in the weeds, and spent the better part of an afternoon clearing it of debris and positioning it under the patched section of roof to catch whatever moisture came. The 5-mile walk to the gas station became a 2-day routine. Bread, peanut butter, canned beans, a large jug of water. the indifferent teenager at the register who had taken to not making eye contact, the walk back with the supplies in the duffel bag, which had developed a hot spot on his left shoulder from the repeated weight. His hands changed, the softness around the palms and fingers that came from years of doing nothing more physically demanding than making institutional beds and carrying plastic lunch trays gave way to something harder. Calluses formed in specific locations, the web between his thumb and index finger, the outside edge of his right palm from gripping the scrap metal bar. He noticed this the way you notice small, true things without ceremony. The land itself became familiar. He learned the direction of the prevailing wind and which corner of the property offered the most shelter from it. He learned the way the light moved across the concrete floor of the hut, through the seams in the panels at different times of day. He learned that the loose section of barbed wire on the northwest fence line made a sound when the night temperature dropped dry and metallic like a clock with a missing tooth. He was not happy here. He was not unhappy. He was present in a way he had not been in 7 years of institutional living, where the rhythms of daily life had been controlled by schedules and bells and the needs of 40 other people. Here the rhythm was the wind and the light and the cold and the quiet of this flat piece of land. He was an inhabitant, not yet a resident, but the difference between those two things was beginning to close. It was on the 11th day that he found the floor. He had been clearing the far northwest corner of the hut's interior, working methodically through what he had come to think of as the debris zone, a collection of collapsed crates, a section of rusted chain, and the remains of what might have been a folding table. The overhead light from his flashlight had been supplemented by a piece of salvaged wire and the single functional battery-powered lantern he had bought on his last supply run. In the better light, the corner was more detailed than he had initially processed. He swept the accumulated grime off the concrete floor with a piece of flat board he had been using as a broom substitute. The floor revealed itself in sections. Most of it was the floor he had already cataloged in his mind, cracked concrete, in no particular pattern, slightly uneven, stained with decades of rust and moisture. The kind of surface that has been left to its own devices for a long time. Then he hit a section that was different. He almost swept over it. He was moving quickly, focused on clearing space rather than reading surfaces. But something slowed him down, something in the quality of the concrete. He stopped and crouched and held the lantern low, angling it to cast light sideways across the surface. A square, approximately 3 feet by 3 feet. The seam around it was clean, not the ragged accidental cleanliness of concrete that is settled and cracked along natural lines. This was the deliberate cleanliness of a joint that had been formed and sealed by someone who understood tolerances. The surrounding concrete was a palimpsest of age and damage. This square was pristine. Eli knelt fully and ran his fingers along the edge of the seam. There was no handle, no ring, no visible mechanism. The surface was flush with the surrounding floor. He set the lantern down and examined the square, systematically moving around all 4 sides, pressing along the edges, trying to determine which side might be the hinged end. Nothing yielded, nothing moved. He went over it again with his fingernails digging into the seam. It was on the 3rd pass that he found it, in the corner where 2 of the seam lines met at the northeast angle of the square. A hole, perfectly circular, no larger in diameter than a standard pencil. Drilled, not broken, too precise and too deliberate to be accidental. Eli sat back on his heels and stared at it. He thought about Walter's workshop, the locked door, the notebooks, the drawings he had glimpsed through the small window diagrams of things with hidden joints and counterweighted panels and mechanisms designed to resist casual discovery. He thought about an old man spending 14 years in a locked workshop, and he thought about what a man with that kind of knowledge and that kind of time would leave behind. He needed something the diameter of a pencil, strong enough to apply pressure. He went to the old door hasp that had separated when he kicked the padlock loose on his first night. It was still lying near the entrance. The steel pin that had connected the hasp body to the wall plate was still threaded through one of the link holes. He worked it free with his fingers and carried it back to the square. He knelt, aligned the pin with the hole, and pressed. At first, nothing. He leaned his weight into it, both thumbs stacked on the head of the pin. From beneath the concrete at a distance that suggested depth came a sound. Mechanical. Clean. A click that was not the sound of something breaking, but the sound of something releasing. Eli grabbed a piece of scrap metal bar from where he had left it against the wall and drove it into the seam on what he had identified as the non-hinge side. He applied leverage. The slab resisted for a moment and then shifted an inch, then two, then the full weight of it became apparent as it pivoted up on a concealed hinge along the opposite edge. It was thick, much thicker than a standard floor section. 4 inches of reinforced concrete, he would estimate later. It came up and over with a final muscular effort and settled against the surrounding floor with a controlled thud, revealing a dark square cavity. The air that rose from below was cold and completely dry, untouched by the damp that lived in the hut above. It was clean in the way that only sealed places are clean, preserved against weather, against seasons, against the slow corruption of time passing through an open space. Eli held the lantern over the opening and looked down. It was not a crawl space. The cavity was lined on all 4 sides, and the bottom with galvanized steel plate, seamed and sealed with the same deliberate care as the floor panel above it. And sitting on the steel floor of the cavity, on a bed of silica gel packets that had turned from blue to pink with age, was a military surplus ammunition box. Olive green heavy gauge with a combination lock set into the latch mechanism. Eli reached in and lifted it out. It was heavier than it looked. He set it on the cleared floor beside the open cavity and looked at the combination lock. A standard rotary dial, 5 numbers. He tried his own birthday. Nothing. He tried what he could remember of Walter's birthday. November, he thought 1945, tried several combinations. Nothing. He sat with the box between his knees for a long time. Then the memory surfaced. Not suddenly. The way things surface from deep water slowly with increasing clarity as they rise. He had been 7 years old, maybe 8, sitting on Walter's lap in the front room of the house in Findlay on an evening in autumn when the light came through the windows at a long yellow angle. Walter had been pointing at a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. The photograph showed a small propeller airplane, a single-engine aircraft with high wings and a fixed undercarriage sitting on a grass airfield. Walter's voice was a low rumble against the top of Eli's head. "See that?" he had said. "That is a Cessna Skyhawk, model 172. You remember those numbers, Eli? 172. They will take you places if you let them." Eli's hands were steady as he turned the dial. Right to 1, left past 1, continuing to 7, right to 2. He pulled the latch. The mechanism released with a clean, solid click. For a moment, Eli did not open the box. He knelt in the lantern light in the northwest corner of a cold metal building in a place he had never heard of 3 weeks ago, with his dead grandfather's coat on his back and the smell of old steel in the air, and he held the released latch and breathed. Then he lifted the lid. The interior was packed with deliberate organization. On top, a large envelope made of heavy wax paper sealed at the flap with dark red wax. His name was written on the front in his grandfather's handwriting. The letters were precise and unhurried. Walter had taken his time with them. Beneath the envelope, Eli could see the edges of other things, stacks of paper banded, a small leather-bound book, and resting in the corner of the box, heavy and old-fashioned, a brass key the length of a large man's hand. He lifted the waxed envelope first, broke the seal. Inside were several sheets of paper folded together, covered on both sides in Walter's tight, angular script. He settled back against the wall with the lantern at his shoulder and began to read. "My dearest Eli, if you are reading this, then 2 things are true. First, I am gone. For that I am more sorry than you will ever know. I had plans for more time. There is never enough of it. Second, it means you were patient and careful, and you paid attention to things other people would have walked past. I knew you would be. You always had my eyes for noticing." Eli had to stop. He looked at the ceiling of the hut, at the curved metal above him in the lantern light, and waited for the tightness in his chest to pass. "I have not left you much." The letter continued. "Not in the way the world measures wealth. The land, the hut, these are a shell. I built them to look worthless because the world is full of people who only pursue things that appear valuable. I needed them to look elsewhere. The real inheritance is not this box. This is only the beginning. The Quonset is a lie, Eli. An ugly, deliberate lie built to protect the truth beneath it. And there is something beneath it. Something I spent 14 years building one careful piece at a time when the money and the health and the time allowed. In this box, you will find a key. You will find a surveyor's notebook. On the first page of that notebook is a map of this property. Go to the northwest corner of the foundation slab. Count 10 paces inward. You will find another surprise in the floor. The key opens what you find there. Go down, Eli. Go down and see what I was really working on all those years in the workshop. Be careful when you come back up. There are people who know this land exists even if they do not know what it contains. Do not trust anyone who comes to you asking about this property. They are not your friends. They never were. I will explain more. This is only the first step. All my love always. Gramps. Eli read the letter 3 times. Then he set it on the floor beside him and picked up the leather-bound book. He opened it to the first page. The map was there, hand-drawn, precise to scale, the outline of the property, the Quonset hut at the center, and in the northwest corner of the structure's footprint, 10 paces from the interior foundation wall, a small X marked in pencil circled twice. He looked at the heavy brass key in the box. It was ornate by functional standards. Cast brass with a barrel grip and a complex bit at the working end. Old design, the kind of key that operated a mechanism rather than a simple pin tumbler. Eli picked up the key and the lantern and stood. The northwest corner of the foundation was 12 feet from where he had found the combination lock box. He paced it out, 10 steps from the interior wall. He crouched and swept the floor with his hand. The steel plate was set flush with the surrounding concrete. It was perhaps 18 inches square, finished in a matte gray that had been coated with dust and grime until it was nearly invisible against the floor. At the center was a single keyhole, the old-fashioned sort, the kind that appears in drawings of doors that lead somewhere important. Eli inserted the brass key. The mechanism resisted for a moment, then gave with a sound that resonated from below, a deep single note, like a bell heard through still water. Something had released, something substantial. He found the edge of the plate and pulled. It rose smoothly, counterweighted as though it had been opened 1,000 times. Not a heavy lift at all, just the easy engineered movement of a mechanism that had been designed to work. Beneath it, a set of steel stairs descended into absolute darkness. The stairs were clean, painted gray. The handrail on the left side was welded at precise intervals. Below, nothing was visible. The air that came up was cool and completely still. Not damp, not stale. Filtered through something below, cycling slowly through a system Walter had built to keep the space intact regardless of what the seasons did to the ground around it. Eli stood at the top of the stairs with the lantern in one hand and the brass key in his coat pocket and looked down into the dark that his grandfather had built. He thought about 7 years of beige rooms and plastic mattresses and the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people while being entirely unknown. He thought about the $6 deed in the pocket of the dead man's coat. He thought about the map drawn in pencil found on a winter afternoon when he was 13 years old, carried for 5 years without knowing what it was for. He thought about Walter's hands, scarred, stained, capable. Go down, Eli. He set his foot on the first step, then the second. The lantern light moved with him into the dark. He descended 15 steps in total. At the bottom, a concrete floor, and directly in front of him, a steel door, round-handled. The kind designed to seal something against pressure. The kind you find on ships, on bunkers, on places built to remain intact when the world outside stops cooperating. He gripped the handle and turned it. The mechanism engaged through several rotations, each one attended by a sequence of solid, orderly clicks, the sound of well-made things working as intended. On the final rotation, he felt the pressure seals release. He pulled the door open. The room beyond came to light as the door cleared its frame, a motion-triggered mechanism activating a series of shielded bulbs along the ceiling that came up slowly as incandescent bulbs do from orange to warm yellow. The space clarified as the light built. It was one long room, the size of a generous shipping container, perhaps slightly larger. The walls were poured concrete, smooth and sealed. Along the left wall ran shelving units packed with organized rows of canned goods, sealed containers of dry food, medical supplies in labeled bins, boxes of water purification tablets, a hand pump assembly connected to a buried water tank. A folding cot was latched to the wall in a closed position. A portable camp stove and fuel canisters were stored beneath the lowest shelf. Along the right wall was a desk, solid oak built to last. On it sat a ham radio transceiver, a stack of engineering notebooks identical to the one upstairs, a standard desk lamp in a second ammunition box larger than the first, sitting with its latches unfastened. Eli walked through the space slowly. He ran his hand along the concrete wall. He looked at the shelving. He looked at the water pump. He looked at the desk. 14 years. Walter had built this across 14 years of quiet work, carrying materials out here in the back of a truck on weekends and evenings, alone, while an 11-year-old boy in a group home in Columbus thought there was no one left in the world who was thinking about him. He had not lost his mind. He had not been eccentric. He had been building something. A place to be safe, he had written. A place to weather the storm. Eli sat down in the wooden chair at the desk. The chair settled under him with the particular solidity of furniture made to remain exactly where it is. He looked at the second ammunition box. Its latches were open. He lifted the lid. The contents were not what he expected. Not tools or supplies or engineering materials. The box was full of documents, thick stacks of them, paper-clipped and tabbed. Maps, internal correspondence, technical reports, all printed on the letterhead of a company called Meridian Chemical Corporation. The documents were organized by year, the oldest at the bottom, the most recent at the top. They covered a span from 1985 to 1992. On top of everything, another sealed envelope. Thicker than the first, heavier. His name written on it in handwriting that was less steady than the first letter. Walter in a hurry, or Walter near the end. Eli held the envelope in both hands for a moment. Outside, above 15 feet of Ohio soil, in the curved metal shell of the building Walter had erected as a decoy, the night was cold and quiet, and no one knew he was here. He opened the envelope. He unfolded the pages. He began to read, and what he read changed the shape of everything that had come before it. Eli read the second letter twice before he fully understood what he was holding. The handwriting was Walter's, but altered. The careful, angular precision of the first letter had loosened here into something more urgent. The letters leaned into each other. The margins were uneven. This was a man writing against a deadline. He could feel approaching getting the words down before the time ran out. Eli, it began. Forgive me, I am writing this in a hurry, and my hands are not what they were. If you are in this room, then you have found the Ark. That is what I called it in my own head, though I never wrote that name anywhere until now. The Ark, because that is what it is. A place built to preserve something true when the world outside is determined to drown it. I have a confession to make, and I'm going to make it plainly because you deserve plainness from me. You have deserved it for a long time, and I was too much of a coward to offer it while I was alive. For 30 years, beginning in 1962 and ending in 1992, I worked as a geological engineer for Meridian Chemical Corporation. My job was site assessment. I evaluated land for development and industrial use. I certified whether ground was stable, whether soil composition was suitable for construction, whether the underlying geology presented any risks. It was technical work. It paid well. It let me give your father a good childhood in a house with a yard and a workshop out back, which was everything I had wanted for him. In 1985, Meridian acquired a waste disposal subsidiary. The subsidiary was called Halloran Environmental Services, though the name was a courtesy and nothing more. Halloran's purpose was to manage the chemical byproducts of Meridian's manufacturing operations. The proper management of industrial chemical waste is expensive. It requires licensed facilities, documented transport chains, regulated disposal sites, ongoing monitoring. It costs real money. Halloran did not do any of that. Instead, across a period of 7 years, from 1985 to 1992, Halloran used sites that I had certified as geologically stable for inert material storage to bury the actual chemical waste from Meridian's plants. Sealed drums, lined in the early years, unlined later when the cost of the liners became an inconvenience. The waste included trichloroethylene benzene and a range of chlorinated solvents that I will not list here because the list would take a full page, and the names mean nothing unless you know what they do to a human body over time, which is to say they dissolve the tissue of it slowly from the inside in ways that do not announce themselves until it is too late. Calder Ridge was one of the 7 sites in 3 counties. It was the largest. I did not know, not at first. They told me the sites were for inert aggregate and construction fill. I signed the reports, I certified the geology, I collected my salary. I went home to my workshop and my notebooks and told myself I was doing honest work. By 1987, I knew I was not. There was a memo circulated internally that year. I should not have seen it, but a man named Cormac Pruitt, who was my site assistant at the time, made a copy of it and left it on my desk without explanation. The memo was from Halloran's operations director to Meridian's board of directors. It was a risk assessment written in the careful language of corporate legal protection, meaning it said everything through implication and nothing through direct statement. It outlined in very controlled language the anticipated timeline for groundwater contamination at the burial sites. It referenced health projections for surrounding residential populations. It described in a single paragraph that I have memorized and will never forget the expected oncological outcomes for communities drawing water from the affected aquifer zones over the following 15 years. They knew. In 1987, the men in the offices knew what the barrels in the ground were going to do to the people living above them. And they continued. They continued for 5 more years because stopping would have required admitting what had already been done, which would have cost more than continuing. I went to my supervisor. I was told that the memo was a worst-case modeling exercise with no operational relevance. I was told that my job was geology, not chemistry, and that I should direct my concerns to the appropriate department. I was told this in the careful voice of a man who has already decided what he is going to do and is merely describing the boundaries of what he will tolerate. I stayed. That is my sin, Eli. I stayed. For 5 more years, I continued to work for Meridian, continued to sign documents, continued to accept my salary. I told myself that I would find a way to address it through proper channels. I told myself that I was gathering information. I told myself that the right moment would arrive. The right moment did not arrive. They never do when you are waiting for them instead of making them. In 1992, I left. I walked out of Meridian's regional office on a Friday in March with a box of my personal effects and a collection of documents I had been quietly copying for 2 years. Survey maps, the real ones, and the falsified versions I had been pressured to produce. Shipping manifests from Halloran. Internal correspondence. The 1987 memo. I took what I could carry without being obvious about it. I went to the EPA. They assigned me a case officer. The case officer referred me to a regional investigator. The regional investigator opened a preliminary inquiry. Meridian's legal team closed it within 4 months by producing a set of documents that contradicted mine and painting me as a disgruntled employee seeking compensation for a wrongful termination that had never technically occurred since I had resigned. I hired a lawyer with the money I had. Meridian's lawyers were better and more numerous. The litigation consumed 3 years and everything I had saved. Your grandmother left during the 2nd year. I do not blame her. I had become something difficult to live with. The guilt and the anger had moved into me and rearranged the furniture. Your father tried to stand by me. He was a good man, Eli. He had his mother's patience and my stubbornness, and I pushed him away because I was ashamed of what I had become, and I did not know how to let someone love a person who had done what I had done. Eli stopped reading. He put the pages down on the desk and pressed both palms flat against the oak surface and breathed. The single bulb above the desk cast its warm yellow light across the room, and Walter's letter, and the stacked documents in the ammunition box, and the hands of an 18-year-old boy who had been told his parents died in a car accident when he was very young and who had never had a reason to think the story was more complicated than that. He looked at the wall for a long time. Then he picked up the letter again. After your parents were gone, he read, I knew that I had already failed everyone I had ever loved. And so I came here. I bought this land under a different name through a holding arrangement that cost me the last of my attorney contacts to arrange. I built what you are sitting in, not quickly. 14 years, Eli. One careful piece at a time on weekends and evenings when my health allowed. I gathered the proof that I had failed to use when it would have been easier to use it. I recorded the names of the people in Calder Ridge who had sickened and died in the years since the burial. I kept the records. In this box underneath my letters, you will find the documents. The originals that I took in 1992 and the copies I made of everything I gathered afterward. You will find the real geological surveys alongside the falsified ones. You will find the Halloran shipping manifests. You will find the 1987 memo. You will also find something else, wrapped in the oilcloth at the bottom of the box. I called it the fight money. It is what remained of my pension after the litigation in the years out here. It is not enough to make you wealthy. It is enough to live on for a time. It is enough if you choose to use it that way to retain a lawyer of your own. I do not expect you to fight this battle, Eli. I want to be clear about that. You owe this place nothing. You owe me nothing. You were 11 years old when I left you, and the fact that you are reading this at all means you survived 7 years without anyone to help you survive them, and that is enough. That is more than enough. You have already done the hard thing. But if you choose to stay, if you choose to use what I have left you, then know that the evidence in that box is real, and it is complete, and it is more than any regulator or prosecutor would need. Know that I tried and failed not because the truth was insufficient, but because I was alone, and I ran out of time and money before I ran out of will. You would not be starting from nothing, my boy. You would be starting from the place I got to before I stopped. Whatever you decide, know that I loved you from the day you were born until the day I could not anymore. And know that I am sorry for every year of those 7 that you spent without a home. Your grandfather, Walter. Eli set the letter on the desk. Not dramatically. Carefully, the way you set down something that belongs to a category of things that should be treated with care. The room was quiet. The filtered air moved in a barely perceptible current from a vent near the floor. The canned goods on the shelving unit were organized by type and dated with a marker in Walter's handwriting, the dates running from 2001 to 2005, the final year of stocking. A man who knew he was running out of time and was making sure the things he had built would last past him. Eli lifted the documents out of the box and set them on the desk. There were more than he had initially estimated. Organized in labeled paperclip bundles. Survey maps, 2 sets, the real and the fabricated, each clearly dated and keyed to site locations by parcel number. Halloran Chemicals internal shipping logs, 1985 to 1992. A sheaf of internal Meridian correspondence, including a document on Meridian letterhead, dated February 1987, that was addressed from the Office of the Vice President of Operations to the Board of Directors and was titled Halloran Site Risk Modeling Summary. Eli read enough of the 1987 memo to understand what it was. Then he set it carefully back in its bundle. Beneath everything, wrapped in a square of waxed canvas cloth tied with cotton twine, was the money. He did not count it that night. He lifted the bundle and set it aside and did not think about what it represented yet, because thinking about it required him to think about the choice it implied, and he was not ready to think about that. He sat in Walter's chair at Walter's desk in the room Walter had built underneath a worthless piece of land, and he understood for the first time the weight of what the old man had carried alone for the last years of his life. He was still sitting there when the lantern battery upstairs began to die, and the light in the room shifted towards something dimmer, and he realized he had been underground for nearly 3 hours. He went back up. He pulled the steel hatch closed behind him. He lay on the concrete floor of the Quonset hut in the dark with Walter's coat pulled over him and did not sleep until almost dawn. He was still there when the morning came through the seam gaps in the corrugated metal and striped the floor with thin lines of gray Ohio light. 3 days passed, then 4. Eli worked during the days, continuing to make the building livable in the incremental way that sustained effort eventually changes things. He reinforced the loft space he had improvised from salvaged boards. He got the oil drum stove working, cutting a flue hole through the metal skin of the hut with a tin snips he had purchased on his last supply run, running a length of salvaged pipe through it, packing the gap with strips of metal flashing. The first fire he built in the drum stove filled the hut with smoke for 20 minutes until the draw established itself. After that, it worked. The interior warmed to something survivable within an hour of lighting. At night, he went down into the ark. He read. He spread the documents across the desk and read them systematically the way Walter must have read them over the years he spent building his case. The chemistry was beyond him in its specifics, but the administrative record was clear even to someone without a technical background. The internal memos tracked a deliberate and documented decision to continue operations after the risks were known. The shipping manifest showed the volumes. The real survey maps showed the locations. And Walter's personal notebooks, the leather-bound volumes stacked on the desk in the ark, those were something else entirely. Walter had recorded names. Not just the corporate names, the executives and the legal team and the operations managers. The names of the people who had lived around the Calder Ridge site. Families. He had tracked them from 1992 onward as best he could from a distance, using county death records and local newspaper archives, and the occasional conversation with someone who remembered him from the years he had worked in the region. The notebook entries were precise and restrained in the way that engineering notation is restrained, but the restraint was load-bearing. It was the restraint of a man holding something heavy and refusing to put it down. Edmund Marsh, age 54, former grain operator, Calder Ridge area. Leukemia diagnosis, 1999. Death, 2003. Residence within half a mile of Site 3 burial location. Harbert Connolly, age 61, retired electrician. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma diagnosis, 1997. Death, 2001. Well water source, Site 3 drainage gradient. 14 names in total logged between 1989 and 2001, logged with their addresses and their illnesses and the year they died. Not listed as statistics, listed as individuals with the kind of specificity that comes from someone who needed to remember that these were people and not data points. Eli closed the notebook on the 14th name. He did not move for a while. The single bulb hummed above him. Outside, the Ohio autumn was doing what it always did, cooling the ground 1 degree at a time, indifferent to everything happening beneath it. The fight money was still wrapped in its canvas cloth in the corner of the desk. He had not touched it again. On the morning of the 12th day, the black SUV appeared. Eli heard it before he saw it, the sound of tires on gravel moving at the deliberate pace of a vehicle that knows where it is going and is not in a hurry. He was outside working on the rain barrel when it pulled up along the outside of the fence line and stopped. It was a large vehicle, late model, expensive in the studied way of things that are meant to signal seriousness rather than wealth. The paint was the color of a formal occasion. A man got out. He was perhaps 55, medium height, built with the kind of sustained fitness that comes from deliberate maintenance rather than physical labor. His suit was charcoal gray, and his shoes were clean despite the gravel, and his hair was silver at the temples in a way that had the look of being carefully preserved at exactly that stage. He had a smile that appeared before his expression did, which was the signature of a man who had spent a long time learning to lead with the smile, so that what came behind it was harder to read. Eli Vance, he said. He had the practiced manner of a man who memorizes names from documents before he uses them in person. He walked along the fence toward the gate with the confidence of a man who considers fences advisory. "My name is Harlan Doyle," he said. "I represent a group called Stonegate Acquisitions. We have been trying to reach the responsible party for this parcel for some time." He gestured at the property with the open hand of a man indicating something he has already assessed. We represent investors with a significant interest in this part of Holt County. We are in a position to make you a very generous offer for this land. He paused at the gate and looked at Eli with the expectation of someone accustomed to that pause, producing a particular response. Eli looked back at him. He was thinking about Walter's letter, the specific passage that had arrived in his mind the moment the SUV came to a stop. They will come, Eli. They will offer you more money than you have ever dreamed of. Enough to go anywhere. Enough to start over completely and forget this place ever existed. What are you offering? Eli said, not because he was considering it, because he wanted to know how accurately Walter had anticipated this. Doyle's smile widened by a fraction. We are prepared to offer $250,000 for this parcel. He let the number stand for a moment in the cold air. For a young man in your position, he said that represents a complete fresh start. Anywhere in the country. Any direction you want to go. He looked at the Quonset hut behind Eli with a brief, unconcealed assessment. The look of a man pricing something he considers salvage. I am not selling, Eli said. The words came out at a normal volume without effort. He had not rehearsed them. They were simply the accurate description of a decision that had been made before the SUV reached the gate. Doyle held the smile for a moment longer, then allowed it to become something more considered. Perhaps you would like some time to think about it. The offer has a window, but it is generous. He produced a business card and held it over the gate. Take a few days. Eli did not take the card. I am not selling, he said again. You should probably leave. Doyle looked at him for a moment the way you look at something that has behaved unexpectedly. Then he retracted the card and put it back in his jacket pocket. He turned without further comment and walked back to the SUV and got in. The vehicle reversed along the fence line and back onto the gravel track and drove away. Eli watched it go. Then he went back to the rain barrel. That night he made the long walk to the gas station and used the payphone on the outside wall. The receiver was cold and the plastic was cracked along the earpiece from years of temperature cycling. He dialed Ms. Wren Ashby's office number from memory. He had memorized it deliberately before he left Columbus, the way you memorize the number for emergency services, hoping never to need it, understanding that needing it was possible. She answered on the third ring. Her voice was the same, professionally measured, but she adjusted it within the first two sentences when she understood it was him. He told her everything. The hut, the floor, the combination box, the letters, the ark, the documents. He told her about Meridian Chemical Corporation and the 1987 memo and the 14 names in Walter's notebook. He told her about Doyle and Stonegate acquisitions and the $250,000. The line was quiet for longer than a standard pause. Eli, she said. Her voice had shifted entirely. The professional register was gone. What was left underneath it was something harder and quieter and more purposeful. Stay on that property. Do not let anyone onto it. Do not talk to anyone about what you found. I am going to make a call. Who are you calling? Eli asked. Stay put, she said. I will be in touch. The line went quiet. Eli hung up. He stood outside the gas station in the cold dark of Calder Ridge and looked at the empty road and thought about Walter sitting in the ark with his notebooks and his documents and his list of 14 names alone for years until the time ran out. He walked the 5 miles back. The days that followed had a different quality. Before the threat had been abstract, a man in a suit with a generous offer, which was the kind of threat that could be deferred. Now Eli understood that the offer was not the threat. The offer was the polite version of something else. He began to pay attention differently. He noticed the truck that sat on the county road a quarter-mile north of the property line for most of 2 afternoons before moving on. A different vehicle from Doyle's SUV. Older, working-looking, but sitting idle in a location with no apparent purpose. He noted the make and the general description in Walter's notebook in the margins beside a geological notation. He noticed that the barbed wire on the northwest fence line made no sound on the night of the 14th day. It had been ticking every night since he arrived. Silence meant it had been touched. meant someone had moved along that section of fence after dark. He slept lightly. He kept the brass key on a cord around his neck. He made sure the hatch to the ark was always secured from below when he was inside it. On the 16th night they came. He woke to a change in the air of the room rather than a sound, the way a space shifts when it is no longer unoccupied. He lay still in the dark on the improvised sleeping platform, Walter's coat over him, and listened. Two sources of movement. Careful and deliberate, the slowness of people who have been trained to move that way or have had enough practice that it amounts to the same thing. The thin edge of a flashlight beam crossed the high wall of the hut and disappeared. They were systematic. They worked the crates first. He could hear the soft displacement of objects being moved and replaced. They worked along the walls. They crossed the floor, their footsteps almost inaudible on the concrete. One of them passed within 4 feet of the sleeping platform. Eli did not breathe. They searched for a long time, perhaps 30 minutes. He tracked their movements by sound and by the intermittent light leakage. They found nothing. Of course they found nothing. The brass key was around his neck, and the hatch was 15 feet away under a layer of swept concrete grit and darkness. Eventually the sounds moved toward the entrance. A pause. The door sliding on its track. Silence. Eli lay still for another 20 minutes after the sound of their vehicle had faded from the property. Then he sat up. He did not turn on a light. He sat in the complete dark of the hut and thought with the focused clarity that adrenaline produces when the immediate danger has passed. They knew the documents existed. Not as a theory, they had sent people to look for them, which meant they were certain enough to commit resources. Doyle's visit had not been a cold approach. He had come knowing what was likely here. The $250,000 offer was not speculation about the land value. It was a price placed on the documents. Eli reached up and touched the key cord around his neck. The ark was safe. The hatch was indistinguishable from the surrounding floor. Walter had built it that way. 14 years of careful work protecting 14 years of careful record-keeping. The following morning, he walked to the gas station again. He called Ms. Ashby's number. She answered on the first ring. Someone was in the property last night, he said. 2 people after midnight. They searched the hut. They did not find anything. A short silence. Then I know. I am sorry I could not warn you. She paused. There is someone coming to see you, Eli. Her name is Petra Holt. She will be there tomorrow. She drives a green pickup, older model. Let her in. Who is she? Eli said. She is a lawyer, Ms. Ashby said. Environmental and community practice. She is someone I trust. And after what you have just told me, she needs to see what is in that room. Eli walked back to the property. He spent the morning in the ark, going through the documents again, with the specific purpose of organizing them into the clearest possible sequence. Real survey maps on top aligned with the falsified versions. Halloran Manifest chronological. Internal Meridian correspondence leading with the 1987 memo. He made a separate stack of Walter's notebooks, the personal record he had kept over 2 decades of tracking what had happened to the people of Calder Ridge. He understood doing this, that the story told by these documents had 2 distinct parts. The first was the corporate record, what Meridian had done, and when and who had known. That part was contained in the official papers and was the kind of evidence that lawyers and regulators could act on. The second part was Walter's notebooks, the 14 names, Edmund Marsh and Harbert Connolly, and the 12 others logged with the precision of an engineer and the anguish of a man who had not been able to stop what happened to them. That part was not legal evidence. It was something else. It was the reason the legal evidence mattered. Petra Holt arrived the next morning in a green pickup truck that was at least 15 years old and had accumulated the evidence of a working life mud on the running boards, a crack in the passenger side mirror, a rear bumper held in place on one side by a length of wire. She was perhaps 29 with dark hair pulled back in the unself-conscious way of someone who considers hair an administrative matter, and eyes that took in the Quonset hut and the land around it, and Eli standing at the gate with the rapid assessment of a person trained to read situations quickly. She got out and introduced herself without preamble. "Eli Vance," she said. "Ms. Ashby sent me." She held up a worn business card. "Petra Holt, Environmental and Community Law." She looked at the hut. "She told me what you found. I would like to see it." "Follow me," Eli said. He took her down into the ark. He showed her the documents in the order he had arranged them. She did not speak while she read. She worked through the stacks with the systematic attention of someone who has read a great many documents and has learned to distinguish between those that say something and those that appear to say something. Her expression changed twice, once when she read the 1987 memo, a small compression around her eyes, and once when she went through Walter's notebooks and reached the page where the 14 names began. After perhaps 2 hours, she sat back and looked at the concrete ceiling for a moment. "Your grandfather built an ironclad case," she said. She was not offering a compliment. She was describing a technical condition. These documents taken together establish prior knowledge at the executive level, deliberate falsification of regulatory submissions, and a timeline of harm that is directly traceable to Meridian's operations. A prosecutor would consider this a complete evidentiary package. "Can we win?" Eli said. She looked at him directly. "Winning is not a single event," she said. "Meridian will have a team of attorneys and essentially unlimited resources to apply to motions discovery challenges and delay strategies. They will argue that the statute of limitations has expired. Our counterargument is that the clock did not begin to run until the evidence was actually discovered, which in this case is the date you open that box." She paused. "That argument is defensible. It is not guaranteed." "What do we ask for?" Eli said. He had already decided this in the ark, reading the documents the night before. He had turned it over for a long time before the answer became clear. "Not money," he said. "Not for us. We ask for remediation, full environmental cleanup of every burial site, and public disclosure." Petra looked at him for a moment. "That is the harder case to make," she said. "Monetary damages give a jury a concrete outcome. Injunctive relief requiring remediation requires the court to supervise ongoing compliance for years. These are the names of people who drank the water," Eli said. He put his hand on Walter's notebook. 14 of them. And there are families still here. They have been drinking the same water. This is not about money." Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once with the quality of someone committing to a course of action they have fully assessed. "Then that is what we file for," she said. That evening, after Petra had driven away with copies of the key documents, Eli sat at Walter's desk in the ark with the second letter spread on the surface in front of him. He thought about the fight money still wrapped in its canvas cloth. He had counted it that afternoon while Petra was reviewing the notebooks. $31,000. More money than Eli had ever held in his life. Less money than a single day of Meridian's legal team's billing rate, which Petra had described to him in the flat tone of someone who considers it useful to know the dimensions of the problem you are facing. He picked up Walter's notebook and opened it to the page with Edmund Marsh's name at the top. He read it again. The address, the diagnosis, the year. Then he turned the page and read the next name, and the next. All 14. Then he closed the notebook and held it in both hands for a moment and thought about what it meant that Walter had written these names down with the same care he used for engineering specifications. Because the care was the point. The care was how an old man in a sealed room said, "I did not forget you. I am sorry. I was trying." The next morning, Eli was in the garden plot he had started clearing on the south side of the hut when the black SUV returned. This time it pulled up to the gate and stopped, and Doyle got out. He was not alone. 2 other men remained in the vehicle. Eli could see them through the windshield. Doyle walked to the gate and stopped there. He did not attempt to come through. "I want to give you another opportunity," Doyle said. His voice had lost the warmth of the first visit. What was left was the structure underneath it. "I think you are a smart young man, and I think you understand that you are in a situation that has some complexity to it." He paused. "Our offer has been revised. We are prepared to offer $400,000 for this parcel. Immediate transfer, no conditions. Eli put down the garden tool he had been using. He walked to the gate and stopped on his side of it. I know who Stonegate Acquisitions is, he said. I know who Meridian Chemical Corporation is. And I know what is underneath this land and what Meridian did to put it there. He watched the information land in Doyle's expression. The face did not change in any dramatic way. The eyes changed. They became more precise. The social architecture of the encounter had shifted, and Doyle was reassessing. You are making an error in judgment, Doyle said quietly. I already made one, Eli said. I waited 3 days to call a lawyer. Get off my property. Doyle held eye contact for a moment. Then he turned and walked back to the SUV and got in. The vehicle did not leave immediately. It sat for perhaps 2 minutes, the engine running. Then it drove away. Eli stood at the gate until it was out of sight. Then he went back to the garden. 4 days after that, Silas Duff appeared. Eli had seen him twice before, briefly at the gas station. A lean man in his 60s with a face that had been worked on extensively by weather and time, driving a farm truck that had been maintained with the careful attention of someone for whom the truck was not transportation, but a working tool without which the work stopped. He had acknowledged Eli each time with the minimal nod of someone who is aware of you without having yet decided what to think of you. Now he pulled up to the property in the farm truck and got out and stood at the gate with his hat in his hands. You the Vance boy, he said. It was not a question. Eli Vance, yes. Silas Duff. I run the Duff operation, used to be 300 acres now, about 160 out on Brannock Road. He paused. He was looking at the ground near the gate rather than at Eli directly. My well went bad in 2009. Water has got a color to it. A smell. The county told me it was a mineral deposit issue. I brought in a private service and they tested it and they told me it was not a mineral deposit issue, and then they sent me a bill and I never heard from them again. He looked up. I heard you have some documents pertaining to what has been happening to the water in this part of the county, he said. Eli looked at him. Who told you that, he said. Word gets around a small place, Silas said. It gets around slow because people here learn to keep their heads down, but it gets around. Eli opened the gate. Come look at something, he said. He took Silas down into the ark. He showed him the geological surveys, the real ones, and explained the overlay. He showed him the shipping manifests and told him what had been in the barrels. He showed him the 1987 memo. Silas read that document slowly. He was not a slow reader. He was reading carefully because he wanted to be sure he understood what he was reading. They knew, Silas said, not as a question. They knew, Eli said. Silas set the document down on the desk. He looked at Walter's notebooks for a moment without picking them up. What are you going to do, he said. File for a mandatory remediation order, Eli said. Full environmental cleanup all sites. Public disclosure of Meridian's internal record. I have a lawyer. Silas looked at him for a moment, assessing something behind his eyes that he did not put into words. I will sign on to that, he said, if you will have me. Within the following week, Eugenia Marsh came. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in a car that was older than Silas's truck and in considerably worse condition, moving carefully up the gravel track as though she was not entirely confident of what the car would do at higher speeds. She was 71 years old, small and upright, with white hair and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have been through the worst thing and come out the other side still standing. She carried a cardboard box. Inside it were photographs of her late husband, Edmund, taken across 4 decades of marriage, his medical records from the years of his illness, a folder of documents relating to the water service account for their property, noting 3 complaints filed between 1997 and 2002, all marked resolved without explanation. Edmund's name was in your grandfather's notebook, she said. She said it without inflection. He wrote down Edmund's name. He wrote down where we lived. He wrote down the year Edmund got sick. Yes, Eli said. He remembered us, she said. After all that time, he was keeping track. He was, Eli said. She looked at the notebook for a long time without touching it. Then she set the cardboard box on the desk beside it and folded her hands in her lap. "What do you need from me?" she said. Eli sat across the desk from her in Walter's chair and thought about the question. He thought about a 71-year-old woman driving a failing car out a gravel road to a metal building on a piece of scarred land because someone she had never met had written her husband's name in a notebook and kept it for 20 years. "Your testimony," he said, "your records, and your name on the filing." She nodded. One small decided movement. "Then you have them," she said. The nights in the Ark had become working nights. Petra drove out twice a week in the green pickup, and they spread documents across the desk and the floor and worked through the legal architecture of what they were building. Eli learned about discovery requests and injunctive relief petitions and the procedural choreography of filing against a corporation with the resources to respond at every point. He learned that the law is a slow machine and that patience is not a virtue in these situations, but a tactical requirement. He also learned in those sessions that what he had was genuinely rare. The combination of Walter's copied originals, the Halloran Manifests, and the 1987 memo constituted a documentary record that had survived precisely because it had been buried 15 feet underground in a sealed room on a piece of land that no one had considered worth watching. The irony of that was not lost on Eli. Meridian had effectively preserved the evidence against themselves by making the land appear worthless, which was exactly what Walter had intended when he bought it. One evening in late November, Petra looked up from the desk and said, "Silas Duff called me. He is having trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Eli said. Petra set her pen down. "Stonegate has acquired his mortgage from the regional bank that held it." She said this in the level tone of someone reporting a fact they find deeply objectionable but not surprising. "The acquisition happened 2 weeks ago. He received a letter yesterday informing him that Stonegate is initiating a review of the mortgage terms under a clause related to change of beneficial use. It is a pretext. The intent is to threaten foreclosure if he does not withdraw from the filing." Eli was quiet. "Can we stop it?" he said. "We can challenge it," Petra said. "It is not certain we will succeed before they do significant damage." Eli looked at the stack of documents on the desk. The fight money, now considerably reduced, sat in its canvas cloth in the corner of the ammunition box. He thought about what Walter had written. "It will be hard. It will be dangerous. They will fight you." He thought about Silas's face in the Ark reading the 1987 memo. The stillness of someone understanding fully and finally what had been done to the water they had been drinking for decades. "Keep fighting it," Eli said. The following morning he drove to Silas's farm. He had borrowed a vehicle from the teenager at the gas station, a transaction conducted with a $20 bill, and the teenager's board assessment that he didn't need the truck until Thursday anyway. Silas was at the fence line on the east field when Eli pulled up. He came over without urgency, the way men who have been working land for decades move economically without wasted motion. "I know about the mortgage," Eli said. Silas looked at him. His expression was the expression of a man who has made a decision and is at peace with it, but is not going to pretend it costs nothing. "They are very good at what they do," Silas said. "Yes," Eli said. "I cannot lose this land," Silas said. "Not because of what it is worth, because it is what I am." "I know," Eli said. They stood at the fence line in the cold air of early December and looked at the flat winter fields. "I am not withdrawing," Silas said finally. "I want that on record." Eli looked at him. The decision had been made before Silas finished saying it. Eli could see that in the set of his jaw and the way he held his hands at his sides, easy and open, the posture of a man who has stopped carrying a weight he had been uncertain about and is now simply standing. "Then we keep going," Eli said. He drove back to the property in the borrowed truck and went down into the Ark and sat at Walter's desk and opened the fight money canvas and counted what remained. It would cover Petra's costs for approximately another 4 months at the rate they were spending. He picked up Walter's second letter from where it lay on the desk's surface and read the final paragraph again. "The choice is yours, my boy. You owe this place nothing. You owe me nothing. Or you can stay. You can be the man I never had the courage to be. He folded the letter and put it in the inside pocket of Walter's coat. He went back up the stairs. Outside, the Ohio winter had settled over Calder Ridge with the patient, indifferent weight of a season that does not negotiate. The sky was a flat gray. The garden plot on the south side of the hut had gone dormant under the frost. The barbed wire on the northwest fence made its dry ticking sound in the cold air. Eli stood outside the hut in the winter morning and looked at his land. 1.2 acres of ground that sat above something buried, something that was going to have to come up eventually one way or another, because the truth does not stay buried indefinitely. It finds the water table. It finds the surface. It finds the light, finally, always. He went inside to get ready for the drive to meet Petra. There was work to do. There is a moment in every fight when the nature of the thing changes, when it stops being about whether you can win and becomes about whether you can endure long enough for winning to become possible. Eli had reached that moment somewhere in the middle of a February that came in hard and stayed hard, with temperatures that kept the ground locked and the sky the color of old concrete, and the days so short they barely qualified as days. The Quonset hut was warm now in the minimal way that a space heated by an oil drum stove and populated by one person can be warm. The walls had been progressively sealed. The loft platform was insulated with salvaged material. The rain barrel had frozen and thawed twice. The garden plot on the south side was under 3 inches of frost-hardened earth that would not yield until April. Eli had been in Calder Ridge for 4 months. He spent his mornings above ground and his evenings in the ark. The pattern had become its own kind of routine, the way all sustained effort eventually organizes itself into a rhythm, whether you intend it to or not. Mornings were the physical business of maintaining the property and his own functioning food fire fence. Repairs the ongoing project of making the hut into something that could reasonably be called habitable. Evenings were the documents, the notebooks, the slow, methodical process of understanding what Walter had spent 14 years assembling. He had read all of the notebooks by this point, every entry. He knew the documents in the ammunition box with the intimacy of someone who has returned to the same texts enough times that they stop being external information and become part of the internal architecture of how you understand the world. Petra came twice a week, sometimes 3 times when the filing calendar required it. The green pickup was a fixture on the gravel track now familiar enough that when Eli heard its engine sound from a distance, he did not look up from whatever he was doing. He knew it was her. She had filed the injunction in January requesting an immediate order preventing Stonegate acquisitions from initiating any further property transactions or contact with residents in Holt County, pending the outcome of the primary litigation. The judge assigned to the case a woman named Hargrove, who had been on the Holt County bench for 11 years, had reviewed the filing and requested a preliminary evidentiary hearing. The hearing was set for the 2nd week of March. In the first week of March, Eli spent 4 consecutive evenings going through Walter's notebooks a final time with a purpose he had not had before. He was looking for a name he had noticed several months earlier and not fully processed a name that appeared in the earlier notebooks in the entries from the mid-90s mentioned twice in passing in the context of the original Meridian site work. Cormac Pruitt. Walter had written the name in 2 separate entries, both from 1994, 2 years after Walter had left Meridian. The first mention was brief, tried to reach C. Pruitt. No response. The second was longer and had the quality of a dead end. Pruitt has moved. New address unknown. He was the only other person present during the 1988 survey revision. He saw what I saw. If he is willing to speak, his account would corroborate the falsification directly. But I cannot find him. Eli read both entries several times. Then he sat back in Walter's chair and thought about what an engineering site assistant from 1985 to 1992 would be in the present year of 2014. He would be approximately 60 years old. He had been deliberately unreachable for 20 years, which suggested either that he had moved far enough to make casual location difficult or that he had made himself difficult to find on purpose. There was a difference between those two things. A man who had simply moved on was one kind of problem. A man who had hidden himself because he was afraid of what he knew was a different kind of problem and a different kind of resource. Eli looked at what Walter had on Pruitt. Not much. A first name Cormac, which was unusual enough to be useful. A job title and a period of employment. And a note from 1994 indicating that Pruitt had left the area and not left a forwarding address. He went upstairs and got the atlas he had purchased on a supply run in November. He came back down and spread it on the desk. He was not going to find Cormac Pruitt in an atlas, but he needed to think spatially about the problem, and thinking spatially about a problem was something Walter's notebooks had taught him to do. A man who worked as a site assistant for an environmental contractor in rural Ohio in the late 80s would not have been a highly mobile professional. The work was regional, the skills were specific. If he had left the area, he had most likely gone somewhere within a reasonable radius. Somewhere he had a connection, family possibly, or simply somewhere close enough that moving did not require rebuilding everything from nothing. Eli thought about Silas Duff, who had farmed the same land for 30 years, and whose knowledge of the region was the layered particular knowledge of a man who had watched it change slowly from the same fixed point. The next morning, he knocked on the door of Silas's farmhouse. Silas answered before the second knock. He was already dressed and had been working since before light, which was consistent with every other morning Eli had encountered him. "I am looking for someone," Eli said. "A man named Cormac Pruitt. He worked as an engineering site assistant in this area in the late 80s. He would be about 60 now. My grandfather lost track of him in 1994. I think he went somewhere nearby, but I do not know where." Silas looked at him for a moment. "Come in," he said. The farmhouse kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and the particular breakfast quality of a house where a person has been cooking alone for a long time. Silas poured 2 cups without asking and sat down at the kitchen table. "Pruitt," he said. He looked at his coffee. "There was a Pruitt family out of Galleon. I am not certain. It was a long time ago." He paused. "There was a man who came through here in the early 90s doing soil testing work for one of the county contractors. A quiet man, kept to himself. I only met him the one time. His first name I cannot recall." "Galleon," Eli said. "It is a town," Silas said. "About 35 miles northeast. Mid-sized. Nothing notable about it." He looked at Eli over the rim of the cup. "You think this man can help you?" "My grandfather thought so," Eli said. 20 years ago. Galleon was a town that had the look of a place that had once expected more of itself and had made a reasonable accommodation with what it turned out to be instead. It was not depressed in the acute way of some rural Ohio communities. It was simply modest with the modesty of a place that has stopped arguing about its own dimensions. Eli drove there on a Thursday evening in the borrowed truck, having spent the previous day making calls from the gas station payphone to the Galleon Public Library, the county assessor's office, and in a moment of lateral thinking, the local Lutheran and Methodist churches, reasoning that a man who had come to a small Midwestern city and stayed for 20 years had likely at some point affiliated himself with a congregation. The Methodist Church on Walnut Street had a Cormac Pruitt in their directory. He had been a member since 1993. Eli wrote down the address and drove there that evening. The house was a small Cape Cod on a street of similar houses, each with a covered porch and a modest yard that had been maintained through the winter with varying degrees of investment. The porch light was on at Pruitt's house. A vehicle was in the driveway, an older sedan with a county parking permit on the windshield. Eli sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. He thought about what Walter had written in 1994. He is the only other person present during the 1988 survey revision. He saw what I saw. A man who had hidden for 20 years had hidden for a reason. That reason was fear. And a man who had lived with 20 years of fear did not open his door easily to strangers who arrived in the evening asking about things he had spent 2 decades not discussing. Eli got out of the truck and walked to the porch and knocked. The door opened after a pause that was slightly longer than normal. The pause of someone looking through the peephole and making a decision. The man who answered was perhaps 60 of medium height, with a face that had been weathered more than his indoor work in recent years, would have weathered it, meaning the weathering was old and came from time spent outdoors in an earlier life. He walked with a slight asymmetry that suggested a healed injury to the left hip or knee. His eyes were careful in the way of someone who has learned to read the entrance of a stranger very quickly. "Are you Cormac Pruitt?" Eli said. The man looked at him. He did not answer immediately. He was assessing. "Who are you?" he said. "My name is Eli Vance," Eli said. "My grandfather was Walter Vance. He was the lead geological engineer at the Calder Ridge sites for Meridian Chemical from 1985 to 1992. I think you worked with him." Something moved through Pruitt's expression. It was not surprise exactly. It was more like the recognition of something you have been waiting for and dreading in equal measure for a very long time. He looked past Eli at the empty street. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. The kitchen was small and clean and had the orderliness of a person who lives alone and has organized their space as a form of control. Pruitt put water on without asking and stood at the counter with his arms crossed while it heated. "How did you find me?" he said. "My grandfather tried in 1994, Eli said. "He could not. I tried differently." Pruitt looked at him. "Your grandfather, Walter Vance." He was quiet for a moment. "I heard he died. Some years back." 2006, Eli said. Pruitt nodded slowly. "He was a good engineer," he said. He said it with the weight of something that had been thought many times and never said aloud. "He spent 14 years building a case," Eli said. "He bought land in Calder Ridge and built a room under it and filled it with every document he could gather. He died before he could do anything with it." Pruitt was looking at the counter. His jaw was set in the way that jaws set when a man is holding something in place by force of will. "I know what he was building," Pruitt said quietly. "He was always going to try to make it right. That was who he was." "I filed litigation in January," Eli said, "against Meridian. Mandatory remediation of all 7 sites and public disclosure of their internal record. We have the documents Walter gathered, the real surveys, the Halloran manifests, the 1987 memo." Pruitt looked up at that. "You have the 1987 memo," he said. "The original," Eli said. "Walter kept the original." Pruitt was quiet for a long moment. The water had boiled. He did not move to deal with it. "I kept copies," Pruitt said. His voice was lower now. "I have had copies since 1992. I took them when I left, and I have moved them with me every time I moved, and I have never used them because I was one man, and Walter had already tried with more than I had, and they had buried him in litigation, and I did not have the resources to survive that." He looked at Eli directly. "I have been carrying this for 22 years, he said. The names of the people who got sick, the knowledge of what I know and what I did not do with it." "I know," Eli said. "My grandfather kept the same list." Pruitt looked at him for a long time. Something was resolving behind his eyes. Eli could see it the way you can see a decision forming in a person before they speak it. He was the kind of man who believed you could fix a thing if you were willing to take it apart carefully enough and find the place where it went wrong, Pruitt said finally. That was how he thought. He was not wrong about that. He was just wrong about how long it would take. He looked at the counter. "I should have come forward a long time ago," he said. "You are here now," Eli said. The hearing in Holt County was set for a Tuesday morning in March. Judge Hargrove's courtroom was a wood-paneled room that had the gravity of a space where serious things had been decided for a long time. It smelled of old paper and radiator heat. The gallery benches were half full, which was unusual for a preliminary hearing in a rural county, and spoke to the degree to which the story had begun to move through the community. Meridian had sent 6 attorneys. They arranged themselves at the defense table with the organized efficiency of a team that had done this many times in many jurisdictions. Their lead counsel was a man named Aldous Crane, who was perhaps 65, silver-haired, with the kind of contained authority that comes from decades of winning in rooms exactly like this one. He wore a suit that cost more than Eli's fight money. Petra sat at the plaintiff's table with her files and her yellow legal pad and her pen. Eli sat beside her. He had been in this room in his mind many times in the preceding weeks. He had thought through what Crane would do and what Petra would do and what the sequence of the hearing would look like. He had not thought about how he would feel sitting in the actual chair, looking across at the six attorneys and the institutional resources they represented, understanding that this was the concentrated force of everything that had been arranged against Walter for 20 years now arranged against him. He thought about Walter sitting in the ark, alone, the notebooks, the list of names. He thought about Cormac Pruitt in the kitchen in Galleon saying, "I have been carrying this for 22 years." Judge Hargrove entered, and the room stood and sat. She was a compact woman with reading glasses on a chain and the no-surplus manner of someone who considers a courtroom a tool, not a theater. Crane opened for Meridian with the structured confidence of a man operating on familiar ground. The filing before the court, he argued, was predicated on documents of questionable provenance assembled by a disgruntled former employee who had spent his final years in what Crane described very carefully as an increasingly detached relationship with verifiable fact. The statute of limitations on the underlying alleged conduct had expired many years prior. The plaintiff was an 18-year-old ward of the state with no professional credentials and no legitimate standing to represent the interests of a community that had not until very recently expressed any interest in being represented. The entire proceeding, Crane suggested in his closing tone, was the product of a young man who had stumbled onto a deceased relative's private obsession and mistaken it for actionable truth. He said all of this in a measured, even voice that was more effective than a loud one would have been. He was not attacking. He was simply describing in the language of reasonable people why this was not a matter for the court's time. Eli looked at the judge while Crane spoke. She was making notes. Her expression was professional and gave nothing away. Then it was Petra's turn. She was precise and economical. She established the chain of custody for the documents: Walter's employment record at Meridian, his site assignments, his departure, and the sealed condition of the evidence room he had constructed on the Calder Ridge property. She introduced the real geological surveys alongside the falsified versions submitted to the EP, noting the specific alterations, the removal of 7 burial site markers from the regulatory submission. She introduced the Halloran shipping manifests. Then she placed the 1987 memo on the record. She read 3 sentences from it aloud, not the whole document. 3 sentences from the risk modeling summary that described in the careful language of corporate liability management the projected health outcomes for populations drawing water from the affected aquifer zones. 3 sentences that had been written by a vice president of Meridian Chemical Corporation in February of 1987, 27 years before this hearing, and that had been intended to remain in an internal file until the people they described were no longer available to contest them. The room was quiet when she finished reading. Crane objected on several grounds. Judge Hargrove overruled 2 and sustained 1 and asked Petra to continue. Crane's cross-examination of Eli was the part Eli had thought about most. He had thought about it the way you think about a known physical obstacle, not with dread, but with the practical attention of someone who needs to know its exact dimensions in order to move past it. Crane approached with the controlled pleasantness of a man who does not consider his opponent a serious threat, but has learned not to be careless. "Mr. Vance," he said, "you are 18 years old. Is that correct?" "Yes," Eli said. "You have no formal education beyond the high school equivalency program administered by the state. You have no professional background in geology, chemistry, environmental science, or law." "That is correct." "You spent 7 years in the Ohio State foster care system following the death of your grandfather." "Yes." "And you arrived at this property which you had never visited before approximately 4 months ago." "Yes." Crane paused. He was building a foundation, laying each stone in sequence. "You are asking this court," Crane said, "to accept that documents assembled by a former employee who was terminated under disputed circumstances. 30 years ago, documents that have been sealed in an underground room on an unmonitored rural property for an indeterminate number of years constitute a sufficient evidentiary basis for a mandatory remediation order against one of the largest chemical corporations operating in this region. Is that a fair summary of your position? Eli looked at him. He did not look at Petra. This was not a moment for looking at Petra. No, Eli said. Crane paused. He had not expected a direct contradiction. Then clarify your position for the court, Crane said. I am asking the court to look at two maps, Eli said. He reached to the plaintiff's table and picked up the folder Petra had prepared. He set both maps side by side on the surface of the witness stand facing the bench. The real geological survey that Walter Vance conducted at the Calder Ridge sites in 1988, and the version that was submitted to the EPA following what Walter's written record describes as direct pressure from Meridian management to alter the site designations. He pointed to the real map, 7 marked burial locations. He pointed to the falsified version, the same geography, the same scale, the same surveyor's notation in the margins. 7 locations absent, removed by hand by whoever had been asked to remove them. I am not asking the court to trust my credentials, Eli said. I am asking the court to look at the difference between these two documents and explain it using any theory that does not involve deliberate falsification of a regulatory submission. He set the folder down. My grandfather was not a disgruntled employee, he said. He was an engineer who made a mistake he spent the rest of his life trying to correct. The documents in that room are not his private obsession. They are the record of what was done here and who knew it was being done. I did not assemble them. I found them. There is a difference. The room was quiet again. Judge Hargrove looked at the two maps for a long moment. She looked at Crane. She looked at Eli. Crane made a recovery attempt pressing on the statute of limitations argument with the technical precision of someone who knows they have lost a point and is falling back to more defensible ground. Petra's response was prepared and specific: the discovery rule, the sealed evidence room, the date of Eli's legal majority as the triggering event for the limitations clock. Then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. Eli did not turn around immediately. He registered it as a sound, a slight change in the air of the room, the movement of people in the gallery adjusting. Then he heard Crane's voice change texture, a barely perceptible tightening, and he turned. Cormac Pruitt was walking up the center aisle. He moved with the slight asymmetry of his old hip injury, unhurried, his face set in the expression of a man who has made a decision that cost him something significant and intends to see it through. He was carrying a box. Judge Hargrove raised an eyebrow. Petra was on her feet. "Your Honor," she said, "the plaintiff requests permission to call an additional witness." Cormac Pruitt. He was the site engineering assistant assigned to Walter Vance at the Meridian Calder Ridge operations from 1985 to 1992. He was present during the preparation of the survey revision in 1988. Crane was on his feet too. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular procedure. The witness has not been disclosed in any prior filing." Judge Hargrove held up one hand. She looked at Pruitt, who had reached the bar and was standing with his box waiting. "Is this witness prepared to testify under oath?" she said. "He is," Pruitt said. His voice was steady in the way that comes not from the absence of fear, but from the decision to act regardless of it. Judge Hargrove looked at Crane for a moment with an expression that was neither sympathetic nor dismissive. "We will take a 15-minute recess," she said. "When we reconvene, I will hear this witness." Eli found Pruitt in the hallway during the recess. The older man was standing near the window at the end of the corridor, the box on the floor at his feet, looking at the parking lot. "You came," Eli said. Pruitt looked at him. He was quiet for a moment. "You drove 38 miles to my house in a borrowed truck," he said, "because your grandfather wrote my name in a notebook 20 years ago, and you read the notebook." He paused. "What would you have done if I had not come?" "I would have made the case without you," Eli said. "It would have been harder." Pruitt looked at him for another moment. Then he picked up the box. "Your grandfather believed you could fix a thing if you were willing to find the exact place it went wrong," Pruitt said. "I think he was right. I think he raised someone who believes the same." He looked at the box in his hands. "I should have come forward a long time ago," he said. I know that. You are here now, Eli said. That is what matters today. Pruitt's testimony lasted 40 minutes. He described the site operations in specific technical detail, the kind of detail that only direct experience produces. He described the 1988 survey revision in sequence, the meeting with the operations manager, the instructions regarding which site markers to remove from the submission, the pressure applied when Walter had objected the final document that was produced. He described his own departure in 1992 and the reason for it. He opened the box and produced his own copies of the key documents, his personal field notes from 1988, which included entries made during the revision process, his copy of the Halloran Manifest from the same period, and a memo he had retained that Walter had not had access to an earlier internal communication from 1986 in which a Meridian operations supervisor had explicitly described the Calder Ridge site as a primary disposal location for chlorinated solvent waste, not inert aggregate. Chlorinated solvent waste. This document, Pruitt has said, was the document that told me in 1986 what the sites were actually being used for. I raised it with my supervisor. I was told to direct my concerns through the appropriate channel. The appropriate channel, as it turned out, had already been made aware and had made its decision. Crane's cross-examination was technically proficient but tactically limited. He challenged the chain of custody for Pruitt's documents, questioned the reliability of a memory spanning 22 years, and suggested that Pruitt's long silence was itself evidence of the unreliability of his current account. Pruitt answered each challenge with the flat accuracy of someone who had spent 22 years living with every detail of this event and had not forgotten a single one of them. When Crane finished, Judge Hargrove called a brief recess and then reconvened the hearing. She spoke for 11 minutes. Hargrove was precise in the same way the most useful tools are precise. She used exactly what was needed and nothing more. She found that the documentary record before the court, taken in conjunction with the sworn testimony of the day's proceedings, presented sufficient grounds to grant the preliminary injunction. Stonegate Acquisitions was ordered to cease all property acquisition activities in Holt County, pending the resolution of the primary case. Meridian Chemical Corporation was ordered to produce its full internal record relating to the Halloran Environmental Services subsidiary and all sites associated with that subsidiary's operations, including Calder Ridge, within 45 days. She noted without elaboration that the two geological survey maps presented during the hearing raised questions that the court expected the discovery process to resolve. She set the date for the primary trial, then she adjourned. The response from Meridian was swift and expensive and entirely predictable. They filed 4 separate motions in the following 2 weeks, each designed to complicate a different aspect of the proceeding. They engaged a second law firm and increased the team at the defense table to 9 attorneys. They produced a public statement characterizing the litigation as an attempt by an inexperienced party to exploit the legacy of a deceased employee's unresolved workplace grievance. Doyle came to the property one final time. He arrived without the SUV in a standard sedan alone, which was itself a change in the tone of things. He stood at the gate and waited until Eli came out, and when Eli did, he could see that something had shifted in the man's bearing. The charcoal suit was the same, the silver temples were the same, but the smile was gone, not even in its calculated version, and without it, Doyle looked like what he was, a man who had been sent to do a job and had run out of the tools the job required. $2 million, Doyle said. The offer is $2 million, a complete resolution of all pending claims and a mutual non-disclosure agreement. Final offer. It expires at close of business Friday. Eli looked at him. He looked past him at the property, the Quonset hut with its patched roof and its oil drum stovepipe. The garden plot on the south side still under frost, but not for much longer. The northwest fence line where the barbed wire made its ticking sound in the cold. The flat Ohio sky above everything, wide and indifferent and permanent. He thought about Eugenia Marsh sitting across the desk in the Ark with her cardboard box of photographs, saying, "He remembered my husband," in the voice of someone for whom that fact had changed something essential about how she understood the years she had spent grieving. He thought about Silas Duff at the fence line of the East Field, standing easy and open, saying, "I cannot lose this land, not because of what it is worth, but because it is what I am. He thought about Cormac Pruitt walking up the center aisle of the courtroom, with his box moving with the slight asymmetry of a man who had been afraid for 22 years and had decided that morning that he was done. "No," Eli said. Doyle looked at him for a long moment. "You understand what the next phase of this looks like," he said. "Yes," Eli said. "You are 18 years old," Doyle said. Not as an accusation now, more as a statement of something he found genuinely difficult to process. "I know how old I am," Eli said. Doyle held his gaze for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked back to the sedan and drove away and did not come back. The EPA's independent investigation was triggered not by the court proceedings directly, but by the combination of the hearing's public record and a series of articles in the regional press that had begun in January as a local interest story and had grown through the testimony phase and Pruitt's appearance into something with a wider circulation. A team of federal environmental investigators arrived in Calder Ridge in April with sampling equipment and the institutional thoroughness of a federal agency that has been publicly asked why it failed to act on something and does not intend to be asked again. They took soil and water samples at 12 locations across the Calder Ridge area and at 4 of the other 6 sites identified in the Halloran Manifest in 2 neighboring counties. The results released in May were not ambiguous. Trichloroethylene at concentrations between 40 and 80 times the maximum contaminant level established by the Safe Drinking Water Act. Benzene at similar elevations. Chlorinated solvent residue consistent with the material listed on the Halloran shipping manifests at depths and in distributions consistent with drum burial rather than natural deposition. The results were published. The EPA issued a formal public health advisory for the affected water sources in Holt County. The story moved from the regional press to the national wire services. Meridian's legal posture shifted not immediately but visibly over the weeks following the EPA's release. Motions that had been filed with aggressive confidence began to be withdrawn or held in abeyance. The 9 attorneys at the defense table became 7 and then 5. Crane remained, but the quality of his arguments in the procedural hearings took on the character of rearguard actions rather than offensive maneuvers. The primary trial, when it came, was 4 days. Eli had expected more. The compressed timeline was itself a signal. Meridian had done a calculation about the cost of continued litigation against the probability of a favorable outcome and had arrived at a number that made settlement discussions more attractive than continued exposure. Crane's opening argument covered the same ground his preliminary hearing position had covered, but thinner now, stripped of the confidence that had animated it in March. He pressed the statute of limitations. He challenged the authentication of the documents. He questioned the qualifications of the plaintiff's technical experts. Petra's case was the documents, the EPA findings, Pruitt's testimony, and the sworn accounts of 11 Calder Ridge residents and former residents who described the progression of illness and water quality complaints across the decades the sites had been active. Eugenia Marsh testified for 40 minutes describing Edmund's illness from the first symptoms through the final months, the water complaints they had filed, the responses they had received. Her voice did not waver. She answered each of Crane's cross-examination questions with the precise memory of someone who has lived with the events being described every day since they happened. On the second day, Crane attempted to re-engage the disgruntled employee narrative with respect to Walter. He addressed it to Eli directly on the stand. "Your grandfather, Crane said, left Meridian under disputed circumstances. He spent the final years of his life constructing what you have described as a case against his former employer. Is it not possible that what he assembled reflects not an objective documentary record, but the perspective of a man who had developed over many years of isolation and personal difficulty, a distorted understanding of his own role in the events he was describing?" Eli looked at Crane. He thought about the arc, the single bulb, the canned goods arranged by date in Walter's handwriting, the notebooks in their careful stack, the list of 14 names written in the same angular hand that had drawn a map and left it in a coat pocket for a boy to find 7 years later. "My grandfather was an engineer," he said. "Engineers do not record things in order to feel better about themselves. They record things in order to produce an accurate account that can be verified against external reality. Everything in those notebooks and those documents has been verified against external reality. The EPA's findings confirm the locations. The manifest confirm the materials. The 1986 operations memo confirms the prior knowledge. My grandfather's account does not require you to take it on faith. It has been independently confirmed by federal investigators, by a corroborating witness who was present at the time, and by the soil of this county. He paused. He was not a disgruntled employee, Eli said. He was a man who made a mistake and spent the rest of his life trying to correct it. I am here because he ran out of time before he finished. That is the entirety of my role in this proceeding. Crane did not have a useful follow-up question. Judge Hargrove's ruling came on the fourth afternoon after deliberation. She ordered Meridian Chemical Corporation to fund a remediation trust of $47 million to be administered by a court-appointed environmental compliance monitor dedicated to the full cleanup of all 7 Halloran disposal sites. The cleanup timeline was established at 5 years with annual compliance reporting to the court. The order included a requirement that Meridian provide written public disclosure of the history of the Halloran operations and the company's internal awareness of the associated health risks. She referred Meridian's executive conduct to the Department of Justice for review of potential criminal liability under the Federal Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Harlan Doyle's real estate license was suspended pending a separate investigation into Stonegate's acquisition of Silas Duff's mortgage. Aldous Crane gathered his remaining files into a case with the efficient composure of a man who has lost before and knows how to absorb it without visible damage. He was out of the courtroom in 4 minutes. His team followed. Petra sat at the plaintiff's table for a moment after it was over. She had her hands flat on the surface, and she was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone taking an accounting of something internal. Then she looked at Eli. Your grandfather would have done this exactly this way, she said, if he had had the time. Eli looked at the empty defense table. He did do it, Eli said. He just needed more time to finish. Eugenia Marsh was in the gallery with Silas Duff. She was holding her cardboard box on her lap the way she had held it since January, with the care of someone transporting something irreplaceable. When Eli came through the bar, she stood and put one hand briefly on his arm, a small, precise gesture that said everything it needed to say and nothing it did not. Silas shook his hand without speaking. That was enough. That evening, Eli drove back to Calder Ridge alone. The May light was long and the fields on either side of the county road were showing the first green of the season, the flat Ohio landscape doing what it did every spring, reasserting itself against the winter, with the patient certainty of things that have been doing this for a very long time and intend to keep doing it. He parked outside the Quonset hut and sat in the truck for a moment before going in. He was still wearing Walter's coat. He had put it on that morning without thinking the way you put on something that has become part of how you move through the world. He sat in the truck in the warm May evening and became aware of it on his shoulders, heavier than the temperature required. He understood sitting there that he had worn it every difficult day since October. Every day he had needed to remember what he was doing this for. He got out of the truck. He took the coat off and folded it carefully over the back of one of the 2 salvaged wooden chairs he had placed outside the hut entrance. He looked at it for a moment. The brown canvas, the corduroy collar, the inside pocket where the map had been for 5 years waiting. He did not put it away. Some things are not meant to be stored. Some things are meant to stay where you can see them. He went inside the hut and crossed to the northwest corner and opened the hatch. The ark was exactly as he had left it that morning. The desk, the radio, the notebooks in their stack. The empty ammunition boxes, both of them, their contents having migrated through the legal process into evidence files and court records and the administrative machinery of remediation oversight. Eli did not sit immediately. He stood at the desk for a moment with his hands resting on the back of the chair, looking at what the room had become. The empty boxes, the organized shelves still stocked with the food Walter had packed in careful sequence. The radio silent, tuned to a frequency no one was broadcasting on. The concrete walls that had been poured one section at a time across 14 years of quiet, determined work. Then he pulled the chair out and sat down. He opened Walter's final notebook to the last page that had Walter's writing on it. The entry dated November 2005, 7 months before Walter died, in a handwriting that was visibly diminished from the earlier entries. The letters still formed with care but smaller, slightly uncertain in their spacing. The entry read, "I am running out of time. I know this now in a way I did not know it 6 months ago. The room is complete. The record is complete. What remains is the person. I have been looking for the right person for 14 years, and I have not found one who is ready. Eli is 12. He is in a group home in Columbus. He does not know about this place. When he is old enough, he will find the map in the jacket. He has always been the person. I should have seen it sooner." Eli read the entry 3 times. Then he picked up the pen that had been sitting in the desk drawer since the first evening he had come down here, unused, in the way that pens in a sealed room are unused, preserved in the dry air against the day when they would be needed. He opened to the first blank page after Walter's final entry. He wrote March 2014. We filed the injunction. He wrote the date of the preliminary hearing. He wrote the date of the primary trial. He wrote the outcome. 47 million. Full remediation. 5 years. Meridian referred to DOJ. Then he turned to the page with the 14 names and he looked at them for a while. Edmund Marsh, Harbert Connolly, the 12 others, each with their address and their illness and their year. He turned to the next blank page and he began to write. Not the names of the dead, the names of the people who had signed onto the filing. Silas Duff, his address, the description of his land, and the bad well that had been going bad since 2009 and would now be addressed. Eugenia Marsh, the 11 other families who had testified or submitted statements. He wrote each name with the same care Walter had used for the names in the earlier pages, because the care was the point, because the care was how you said that these are people and not data. And their names mean something to someone and will go on meaning something in this room for as long as this room exists. He wrote 38 names. When he was done, he set the pen down and closed the notebook and put it in the center of the desk. He looked at the room Walter had built. The shelving, the water pump, the folding cot still latched to the wall. The radio. The desk with its patina of use, the surface worn smooth in the places where Walter's forearms had rested across years of evening work. The smooth concrete walls that had been poured and sealed one section at a time across 14 years of weekends and evenings by a man with scarred hands who carried something too heavy to put down and built a room for it instead. This was not a tomb. It never had been. It was a foundation. He turned off the desk lamp and climbed the stairs and pulled the hatch closed behind him and came out into the Quonset hut in the long May evening light that came through the seam gaps in the corrugated metal and striped the concrete floor with the same lines it had striped every evening since he arrived. He went outside. Walter's coat was still folded over the back of the chair where he had left it. The canvas held the shape of it, the particular drape of a garment worn so many times it has learned the body that wears it. The air was warm for the first time since October. It carried the smell of turned earth and new growth from the fields to the east. The sky was the color of a clear evening in flat country where there is enough open space around you that the sky can do the full work of what a sky does. The blue deepening toward the horizon, the first stars beginning to assemble themselves in the east, the light going slowly from gold to amber to the first blue of dusk without anything in the landscape to interrupt it. He stood in front of the hut and looked at his 1.2 acres. The garden was growing on the south side, green and deliberate. The fence line was intact, the loose section of barbed wire on the northwest corner mended by his own hands in February. The rain barrel was full, the oil drum stovepipe pointed at the sky from the patch roof. He heard a vehicle on the gravel track and turned. Eugenia Marsh's car came carefully up the road in the evening light, moving at the considered pace she always moved at, as though speed was something she had decided years ago was not worth the cost. She parked and got out, moving with the deliberate precision of a woman who has decided that age is an administrative inconvenience rather than a constraint. She was carrying a thermos in one hand and a covered dish from the car's back seat in the other. "I thought you might want company," she said. She looked at the hut and then at the land and then at Eli. "I also thought you might not have eaten." She set the covered dish on the wooden chair beside Walter's coat and poured coffee from the thermos into 2 cups and handed one to Eli. They sat. The evening settled around Calder Ridge in the way that evenings settle around flat country, slowly and completely, with nothing to interrupt it. The light went from long and golden to low and amber to the first blue of dusk. Somewhere to the north, a bird called once and was quiet. Eugenia looked at Walter's coat folded on the chair between them. "You wore that every day since you got here," she said. "Most of them," Eli said. She nodded, looking at it. It was a simple nod, not weighted with interpretation, just the acknowledgement of a true thing. "Edmund's name is in that notebook," she said after a while, not as a statement requiring response, just as something that was true and that she was letting sit in the open air for a moment. "Yes," Eli said. "He was a quiet man," she said. "He would have liked your grandfather, I think. 2 quiet men who paid attention to things other people walked past." Eli looked at the horizon where the last of the daylight was holding on at the edge of the flatland before releasing it entirely to the dark. He thought about paying attention, about what it meant to notice the particular quality of a seam in a concrete floor, the sound a barbed wire fence makes at low temperature, the diameter of a hole drilled precisely into the corner of a slab. He thought about what it meant to carry a piece of paper in a coat pocket for 5 years, because it belonged to a story you did not yet understand, because something in you knew the story was real even before you knew what it was. He thought about Walter drawing the map, taking time with it, getting the scale right, the proportions, the precise position of the structure within the property boundary, and then writing 4 words along the bottom edge in the handwriting Eli had known since before he could read. For Eli, when ready. He had not known he was ready until he was here. That was the thing about readiness. You could not know it from the outside. You could only know it from inside the thing itself once you were already in it. "My grandfather did not leave me land," Eli said. He was not addressing Eugenia exactly. He was saying it aloud for the first time to hear how it sounded outside his own head after carrying it for months. "He left me a direction. He left me a choice." Eugenia wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at the same horizon. "That is what the good ones do," she said. "They point you somewhere and trust you to find your way there." The first stars were fully present now. The garden was a quiet shape to the south. The hut stood at the center of the property with its patched roof and its mended seams and its oil-drum stovepipe looking exactly like what it had always appeared to be. On the surface, a worthless structure on a worthless piece of ground in a place no one had any particular reason to notice. And below it, 15 feet down through the concrete and the steel and the careful work of a man's final years, the room that had preserved the truth until the right person came to find it. The room that was a foundation now, not a hiding place. Eli drank his coffee. "What is the most important thing you have ever inherited?" he said. That had nothing to do with money. Eugenia considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She was quiet for a long moment, looking at her cup, looking at the stars coming up over the flat land, looking at Walter's coat folded on the chair between them. "The knowledge that someone thought I was worth remembering," she said, "that someone kept track." Eli nodded. He looked at the coat. That was it exactly. That was what Walter had left him. In the end, not the land, not the documents, not even the fight itself. The knowledge that someone had kept track. That across 7 years of beige rooms and temporary beds and the particular invisibility of a child the system had taken in but never quite seen, an old man with scarred hands had been underground in a sealed room writing it all down, making sure the record was complete, making sure that when the time came, the right person would find it and know what to do. The stars were out in full now over Calder Ridge. The first fireflies of the season moved through the dark air above the garden, small and intermittent, appearing and disappearing. the way small true things do briefly without announcement, leaving light behind them. Eli sat with his coffee in the evening in the company of a woman who had also kept track of things, who had carried her husband's name and his records and his photographs through years of quiet grief and had brought them here when it mattered. He sat with Walter's coat on the chair between them and the hut behind them, and the ark beneath his feet, and the 47 names in the notebook on the desk below. 14 of them gone, 38 of them still here. All of them remembered now in a room built to make sure that nothing true would be lost. If you have made it this far in this story, then you already know it is not really about land or money or even about justice, though it is about all of those things too. It is about what we carry forward from the people who loved us. It is about the maps they leave in coat pockets and the rooms they build in the dark, in the 14 years of patient work they do so that someone someday will have what they need to finish the job. If someone left you a direction instead of a destination, if someone kept track of you when you did not know anyone was watching, if you have ever had to choose between the easy way and the right one, and found yourself somehow on the harder road, then this story is yours as much as it is Eli's. What is the most important thing you have ever inherited that had nothing to do with money? Leave it in the comments. Every name matters. Every story counts. That is what this place is for.